translation is exactly the It's an extraordinary book. Everybody I've given it to's read it. Is floored to thank me hugely. So,
real quick, Mark. By the way, gentlemen, if you don't have a Newman Club book, how many do we have left, Mark?
I've got, let's see, four times, 80.
We've got 80 books left. Thank God, it's more than I thought. Okay, so if you paid your dues, you can have a book. Okay, if you haven't paid your dues, go see Greg Keller.
And if you have the book and haven't paid your dues, give it back.
Okay, guys. We're going to give it up for a special guest today. This is Judge Colensi, who's going to be talking about Vienna and the Battle of 1683. Come on, Judge, you're up.
Newman reading first, Judge?
Oh, I'm sorry. We have a Newman Club meeting. Go ahead, Mark.
So this month is dedicated in our Catholic faith to Our Lady of Sorrows, right? We just celebrated her feast day last Saturday. And so, of course, our beloved Cardinal Newman wrote about Our Lady of Sorrows. So I'm going to read something from him on that particular topic. Mary is the vas insigne devotionis, the most devout virgin. To be devout is to be devoted. We know what is meant by a devoted wife or daughter. It is one whose thoughts center in the person so deeply loved, so tenderly cherished. She follows him about with her eyes. She is ever seeking some means of serving him. And if her services are very small in their character, that only shows how intimate they are and how incessant. And especially if the object of her love be weak or in pain or near to die. Still more intensely does she live in his life and know nothing but him. This intense devotion towards our Lord, forgetting self and love for him, is instant in St. Paul, who says, I know nothing but Jesus Christ and him crucified. And again, I live not I, but Christ liveth in me. And that I now live in the flesh, I live in the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and delivered himself to me. But greatest was St. Paul's devotion to our Lord. Much greater was that of the Blessed Virgin Mary, because she was his mother, and because she had him and all his sufferings actually before her eyes, and because she had the long intimacy of 30 years with him, and because she was from her special sanctity so ineffably near to him in spirit. When then he was mocked, bruised, scourged, and nailed to the cross, she felt as keenly as every indignity and torture inflicted on him who was struck at herself. She could have cried out in agony at every pang of his. This is called her compassion, or her suffering with her son. And it arose from this that she was the vas insigne devotionis.
Judge, you're on.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. September 12, 2023 is the 340th anniversary of the Great Battle of Vienna of September 12, 1683. Now, let me start off with a disclaimer. There's a sort of a personal reason why I got into this whole subject, of the Battle of Vienna. And it's sort of, we all know from history about Vienna. All of us have been to Vienna, I'm sure, at least once. And it's a lovely city. As a tourist, you know, you read the Michelin guide and you sort of think you know what you're seeing. But I got to tell you, after the 10th Gothic cathedral in Europe, it began to sort of all blend. After you've seen one, you kind of seen them all, except the one for Vienna. And there's a reason, a personal reason. I want to disclaim right up front that I knew about King Sobieski from Poland, from the 1600s, of course. Back in Hamtramck, where I was born, Michigan, there was a street named Sobieski, just a couple blocks away. He was a big, important king. I knew about the Battle of Vienna when I got to college as part of the studies of history. That's okay. But I was basically a tourist until I got into genealogy. And when I got into genealogy, when an ancient Polish book of heraldry, I found an ancestor who fought in the Battle of Vienna of 1683. He was a captain of a hussar unit, and that really intrigued me. And so I started getting further into the subject. So many trips to Vienna, of course, as a side trip, because you go to Poland primarily, and then of course you go to other parts of Europe. And I visited Vienna, and then visited Kahlenberg, which is the heights above the city. And I visited the cathedrals, I visited the battlegrounds. But always there was something that was not quite sitting with this history that I was matching with my genealogy and the history books, shall we say. And so, for example, I went further into the genealogy and discovered that he fought in the Battle of Vienna with King Sobieski. He was a hussar captain of his own unit. And then I discovered that in those days, if you had a unit, you had to pay for it. In other words, you had to be a rich member of the nobility to be able to afford to, because the average unit was about 150, 200 men. Now, they used to sort of have a rule of thumb, you had to own at least 17 villages to be able to afford a small unit to fight. In the meantime, you have to buy the horses and the wagons and all the equipment and the armaments. So the captain was a rotmistrz. Rota is a name for the unit, equivalent to our cavalry company in the United States Army. And the mish means the commander. So that made more sense until I discovered that he didn't die in the Battle of Vienna. He didn't go back to Poland because he died at the Battle of Potocany. Now, what in the world does that have to do with King Sobieski? And so we had to get further into it. So we visited Hungary, because Potocany, it turns out, is east of Vienna, about 30, 50 miles. And it was the second day, two-day battle, which was about a week or two after the Battle of Vienna. The whole theory is that you beat up the Muslims, and they decided to go to Buda, Budapest, Hungary. So the name of the game is to go and chase after them and make sure they go all the way back to Constantinople, because once they're back into Buda, then they'll reinforce and re-establish themselves and re-attack. So that was the reason for the Battle of Potocany, which was a dreadful battle. Something like 30,000 Muslims died in a two-day battle, and the Polish army was much better off. All right, so many trips to Vienna, many trips to Potocany, 2 trips to to Buddha. If you're getting the idea that I was using my genealogy as an excuse for tripping in Europe, you're right. It's more fun when living by identifying yourself with the history. History becomes real. And that's why I found it so rewarding. Okay, now let's get to the battle itself. The interesting thing, and in the handout, I have an outline of the historic dates. I didn't want to go through all of that tonight because I knew we would be short of time. So, the bottom line is, where did the Turks come from? They are not indigenous to the Turkish peninsula as we know it today. They came somewhere further east, beyond the Tartars, somewhat west of China. That no one really knows, but we know that they eventually came because they surmised because of the Mongolians. When the Mongolians beat up on them, they moved west into Persia. And while the people were in Persia, they got more and more numbers. They were basically refugees. And then they became dominant. So Persians said, push them out. And so they went further west. And they got to, we know that the Arab, because at this point, the Prophet was born, and the Arab Empire was being established, and the Turks sort of made contact with the Arabs, and they got sort of converted to the Muslim faith. And then they moved into Anatolia. Anatolia, of course, is mostly Turkey today. And then they displaced the Greeks. And so you might say that it was infiltrate, dominate, expropriate, and kill, and enslave. That's the way, and if you look in your handout, you will see how literally, step by step, they kept expanding the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Now, Suleiman the Great did a real job, but he got pushed back from Vienna initially. So 100 years later, Kara Mustafa, who becomes the Grand Vizier to the Hancho in Istanbul, he comes into doing the final battle to destroy Christianity and conquer all of Europe. Remember, in those days, at that point, Muslims had all of North Africa. At one point, they were into Spain, but the Spaniards were able to push them back into Algeria. Some left along the coast, but basically they pushed them out. So the Turks decided to go into Europe through the eastern end, and that's why they went through the Balkans. And you can see your outline how literally every 2 years, boom, they got into more territory. Now the plan was you infiltrate, you dominate, which means you become the biggest group there, then you dictate. Once you dictate, you control, and then you can enslave. Now, remember, the Turks were smart. They did not enslave everyone. They gave you the choice. You can remain even a Christian as long as you pay us enough money, and as long as you do what we want you to. In other words, if you become our slaves, you can continue worshiping your God. If not, you either have to convert or we kill you. Now, the reason they needed slavery is because the slaves produce the productivity to be able for them to further expand their empire. No, it takes a bunch of food to feed a bunch of people in arms. Someone has to make the armaments, someone has to do all of this, you need slaves. By the way, do you know that the word slave means and comes from the word Slav? The Slavic people were the primary source of Turkish slaves. And thus you have Croatian, that by the way, they were very favored. They enjoyed enslaving 10, 11-year-old boys. It doesn't take too much to figure out why, because when you have an army away from home for a couple years, they were called comfort. That is the beginning of the Janissaries, because by taking a Slavic boy who is used for comfort in a military camp for a couple years, when he becomes big and strong, he can't go back home because his village would not accept him. He cannot become Muslim because they won't accept him. And so he became a Janissary. And they were the most fearsome warriors in Europe for years, the Janissaries. So we now know where the slaves come from. We know what they're doing. And Kara Mustafa decides, as the Grand Vizier, he's going to, once and for all, resolve the problems with those Christians. You know, if you came from a desert country, because a big chunk of Turkey is not exactly lush greenery, and you look at those rolling fields in Austria, in Poland, in Ukraine, in Bavaria. They've got trees, they've got streams, they've got wild animals. You can shoot a deer or two, and you can live very well. You can make a log house, and you can protect yourself from the elements. That's a lot better than living in the desert out in Anatolia. And so we expand. Now, you will recall from my last speech here about, what, a year and a half ago, where I described after the invasion in Ukraine, that especially the Lithuanian, because Poland and Lithuania at that point were in a commonwealth, and they were together. And so the Lithuanian kingdom was basically from the Baltic all the way down to the Black Sea. Now, the Turks keep chipping away. They keep biting pieces of it away. And there was constant fighting between the Turks and Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in lots of little battles. King Sobieski developed a reputation in Europe as being the guy that can handle the Turks. So, the Grand Vizier, in the meantime, decides to organize an army that will solve the problem once and for all. And he assembles an army of 250,000 troops. Just picture that, 250,000 people under arms. How much does it take to feed them? How about their horses? What about their carts and the oxen? And what about the servants that have to serve them? And that's why the way they organized, they didn't all come from Turkey. Most of their troops were conscripted from the conquered lands that they had, from Croatia, from Moldavia, from Bosnia, Herzegovina, from all these, Macedonia, and all of these now were conscripted, and you're part of that 250-man army. He reassembles them and proceeds to move north to conquer Vienna, and he, through his spies, knew that the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold decided early on, because by the way they also had spies, so the Christians knew that this army was assembling down there, and there's a reason for them to assemble, is to go north and conquer Vienna. So we got to do something about it. The Holy Roman Emperor decides, well, he'll go to Poland, and he made a treaty. And the treaty was that if he gets attacked, if Vienna gets attacked, the Polish king will come and help him. And so he sits back and he is fat, dumb, and happy in Vienna, in his palace, because he's protected. He's got his army, and of course, if necessary, the Poles will come and bail me out. Well, the Turks, the Ottoman Empire is coming forward north. They're coming. And 91 days before the battle, they encircle Vienna with the Turks. They bring in 30,000 troops to actually do the embattlements, to get to the walls, because the walls are pretty good. And the day before, they actually encircled the whole city of Vienna. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold is out hunting. He was enjoying it. He was fat, dumb, and happy. He was happy with it. Well, the next day, he sees them coming up to his gates. And he said, oops, this is getting serious. So, being the good emperor that he is, leader of men, under arms, he takes 20,000 Austrian troops and gets out of town. And he runs and he hides. He hides in Linz, which is as far west of Vienna as you can get and still be in Austria. Well, things are getting bad because the city is in dire need. They cannot get out, and they're running short of food, supplies, ammunition. The Pope sees what's going on. He knew, so he sends his envoy to the Polish king up in Warsaw and says, Your Excellency, Your Highness, and all that, greetings from His Holy Father in the Vatican, wonderful, Vienna will fall. They cannot hold out any longer. Why not? Well, we've got walls. Well, the French, believe it or not, are helping the Turks. The French have their engineers who are in charge of burrowing under the walls of Vienna, laying dynamite to explode and thereby breach the walls to invade the actual city. Now, why the Polish king alone and the Polish people are supposed to come and save Vienna? The Lithuanians were part of the Commonwealth. They came eventually. They were slow to come and early to leave to the battle. Well, what about non-Catholic countries? There were Germanic, like Bavaria, they sent some troops. There were some Austrian troops there. But what about the French? The French were not about to help. But what about the Protestants? They were Christian, but in England they were busily killing off whatever Catholics they can get a hold of at that time. Remember Cromwell and that guy? And stealing the Catholic properties and churches and monasteries. So they weren't going to come and help. Do you think this king of Sweden? The king of Sweden was afraid that the Polish would come and take his crown. That's why he had to invade Poland, as the Swedes did. So no help from Russia. They weren't about to help. So the burden falls on the Polish king and the Polish troops, and Austrian that was left that the king did not take with him when he ran away, the emperor, and the Bavarians are there. So there's 30,000 Polish troops that are brought down on forced march. Now, the reason forced march, the story is, as the papal delegate is there, Vienna sent this emissary and said, King Sobieski, help, we are desperate. Food supplies are short. There are no mice left in the city. You know what happened to them. And they said that they started to eat horse meat, and things were really desperate. And says the Polish king to the Austrian delegate, and who's in charge of the, now where's the emperor? And the delegate simply looked down and could not bring the words out to say that he abandoned his troops and he's out hiding in Linz. The king simply looked at him and said, I see. So who's in charge? Well, they've got Count so-and-so. Wonderful. And what's left of that army is inside, but they're in kind of bad shape. So that's why there was a forced march from Warsaw. And of course, King Sobieski is kind of a historic religious figure because he goes to Częstochowa and he attends Mass at Częstochowa. King Sobieski and the Prince Jakub, his oldest son, ride all the way to Vienna horseback, along with the troops. He does not take the royal carriage, which was kind of a symbolic that they were suffering with this forced march, the troops, so he would be with them. Unlike, unsaid, no one ever says this, unlike that emperor that's sitting in Linz with 20,000 Austrian troops protecting him. All right, so now, after Częstochowa, he stops for Mass in Kraków. Of course, everyone has to go to Kraków when you're in that area of the world. And from Kraków down to Prague, and from Prague, boom, he's on the outskirts of Vienna. At that point, he calls a council of all the princes and all these assembled allies that are willing to help fight to save Vienna. And they decide on, one, who's going to command all of the troops, and two, tactics. And at that point, not only do we see this leadership ability, but also the brilliant tacticianer. If you recall, when you were in Vienna, that Vienna literally is at the end of the Alpine string of mountains. You know, that Alpine route that starts there at Vienna and goes all the way to France. Now, they call them the heights. So it's not really mountain, but it's kind of high, the high hill. There is a monastery at the top of that hill, the highest hill. It's called Kahlenberg, the Kahlenberg Hill. And Kahlenberg at that point had a monastery. It's Camaldoli's order. It's a kind of a strange order. They are semi-hermits. They only get together at lunch or at meal time, and the rest of the day and night is spent isolated in your little cell or at your work doing whatever. Anyway, they had a monastery there, which, by the way, was paid for by a Polish magnate who convinced an earlier, a couple hundred years earlier, Emperor Austrian to give permission to build that monastery on top of the hill. And so there's that Polish route. That monastery was paid for by this Polish magnate, who, by the way, founded a same type of order in Kraków. And you can go to that order if you want, if you're in Kraków next time. It's a very interesting old historic building. There's some monks. Anyway, getting back to the battle, Sobieski decides to basically take the Austrian and Bavarian troops and have them engage the Turks on the level ground east of Vienna, the city of Vienna, basically. And the Poles would take the high ground, which was considered the hardest attack, because if you go to the Kallenberg today, you will see it's a lovely view of the city of Vienna, but between the view hilltop and the city is lots of dreadful woods and underbrush and vineyards. Now, picture getting your horses, your wagons, and all of this down through those woods and takes time and was the most difficult terrain. Whereas on the flat ground, you're able to assemble your troops in line and attack or fight or defend or whatever. So, on the morning of September 12th, 1683, by the way, in the meantime, during the siege, that monastery on top of the hill got demolished. The Turks had effective cannon balls that would burn, knock the building down. Cool. So in the ruins of the monastery, up on the hill at 4 o'clock in the morning, the papal legate sent by the Pope celebrates Mass, and the king decides he's going to serve that Mass. He's the altar boy. On the ruins of the church. And then, boom, the attack starts. So all the fellow princes and all this, that go to their troops and they attack, and the battle rages all day. And the guys on the flatland are having a heck of a time. And they're saying, unleash the hussars. King, please, because the hussar was considered the most elite fighting force. And that's why you've got pictures in your handout of these guys. I mean, these were fully hammered, the horses were, and they had those long spears. So that was the whole idea. They were the cutting edge. They said, please, because give us. The king said, just a minute, let me get my people in order. And he sent his spies out to see exactly where the Turks were massing. And finally, at 4 o'clock, boom, he gives the order, attack. And the hussars do just that. And the battle rages viciously. But by 6 p.m., Kara Mustafa and his troops pick up and they take their jewels and run. And and the Polish hussars enter into his compound. And that's where they get the famous stirrup from the saddle of the Kara Mustafas, which, by the way, was given to the Pope as a symbol of victory by King Sobieski. And Pope John Paul II, before he visited Istanbul, he took it from the Vatican Museum, that stirrup, and he sent it to Turkey, which you now have to go to Turkey to see the stirrup of Kara Mustafa. It's not part of their collection. It was a sort of a goodwill gesture that the Pope John Paul, who is the son of Poland, and he's giving back the stirrup. All right. So the whole idea, if you know anything about tactics, is if you've got the advantage, you press it. You don't stop and take a rest. And so the Duke of Lorraine, who actually, for an Austrian, he did a pretty good job with his troops, whatever he had left after the emperor ran off with 20,000 of them. And he advocated that they follow and engage the Turks again. King Sobieski said, no, remember, he had 30,000 troops from Poland, and there were only 3,000 hussars, by the way, and the average company of hussars was 150, so you can see how that was the big elite group. And by the way, Captain Kalinsky was one of those company commanders. All right, so that's why the Battle of Parikani occurs a couple weeks later, which is at Esztergom, just north of Esztergom, which is, the Parikani is the old name which is now part of Slovenia, but it's on one side of the Danube. On the south side is Hungary. So if you go back there, you can. I went there, and it's the reason for Parkani is that was a bridge across the Danube, and when the Turks took flight, they needed to be at the bridge, and that's when the Poles came at them with the Austrians, and they slaughtered. I mean, 20,000 Turks lost their lives at the Battle of Parkani. I mean, that's substantial. Now, from all of my little trips to Europe and Vienna in particular, I picked up a few tidbits. And what is interesting to me is that history truly belongs to the person who writes the history book. We've all heard that. And I now taste it, because when I read the Michelin Green Guide, which I brought in here, they talk about the Kahlenberg as being a high view, great view of Vienna, and it has a great restaurant. That's it. Now, there's a museum there, there's a church there, which was built by Polish immigrants in 1830-40 is when they built the church, because they wanted to commemorate that this was the place from which Vienna was saved, and by saving Vienna, they saved Christianity and repelled and pushed the Muslims back to their place in Turkey. Well, St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna is a gorgeous cathedral, one of these good old Gothic, lovely cathedrals. It's got a lot of history. And if you go there next time, go out the front door and turn to your left and go to the side wall, the left side wall of the cathedral, and look up, and you will see a cannonball still lodged in the wall of the cathedral, which the Turks lobbed into the city. And the Austrians kept it as a memento. I think that's really kind of romantic. But you can still see it. Another thing, by the way, you don't see that in the history books. You don't see that in the Green Guide, but now you know about it because you've been here tonight. So there's also, if you look at that cathedral, the Green Guide will tell you that during World War II, due to the war, the cathedral suffered a fire in the roof and partially damaged, but was quickly repaired after the war. That's paraphrasing the Green Guide. Here's what really happened. During the war, there was something called the bombing of Dresden, where the English decided to take vengeance for the bombing in London, and the Americans sent a few planes as well, and they leveled the downtown Dresden, carpet bombing. Leipzig also got it, and that's not so far away from Vienna, you know. So the good fathers of Vienna said, the Allies are going to come and bomb us. After all, we're good Nazis, are just as good as the ones from Saxony. So, what to do? Let's trick those Allied bombers, Air Force people. And the way we'll do it is we'll set fire. The fire smoke will cover the downtown Vienna, and the bombers will be confused. Wow. And they did. They set fire across the plaza. When you walk out of the front of St. Stephen's, there's like a plaza, and across the street is a rug shop. They sell Persian rugs. They set fire to that as one of the buildings to fire, and the rugs created good smoke. And it filled the air with smoke. It also sent up sparks. And it's sparks from that fire that landed on the roof of St. Stephen's that started the fire. You will not see that in any tourist book. No Austrian will tell you about that because, sort of like the story, none of them want to talk about the Holy Roman Emperor that ran and hid in Linz. They won't talk about that. As a matter of fact, after the war, one of the things that the Holy Roman Emperor, when he got word that Sobieski beat up on the Muslims, he was beside himself. Why? Because the next morning after the battle, Sobieski and the other Allied leaders went into the city and saw the conditions, and he went to church, to Mass. But out of protocol, the king decided he would not go to Mass at the cathedral. Instead, he went to another church, a Benedictine church in town, for his Mass, also done by the legate. And we've got a historic account of his attendance at that Mass. Now, the Holy Roman Emperor thought that the king and all the other princes who fought the battle should have waited until he and his entourage arrive in the city so that he could be the first to enter victoriously and become the victor of the battle. The problem is that King Sobieski stole his thunder. And to show his unhappiness, as they were introducing the Holy Roman Emperor to the other leaders, Sobieski says, "Oh, by the way, I would like you to meet my son, Prince Jacob." And the Holy Roman Emperor did not even bother to take his hat off. And that apparently was considered bad manners. That you're supposed to, being introduced to a person of equal dignity, you're supposed to take your hat off. Well, all right. So Sobieski goes back, and you've got Vienna saved. Now, why didn't others join the Battle of Padacani? And the answer is the Bavarian prince and said, I want another battle where I can be in charge. And he found a particular enclave of Muslims that he would be leading the troops so that he could have victory. And Sobieski said, no, let's get rid of those people before they get to Buda and Pest. And he said, well, if you're going to be like that, I'm taking my troops back home. And they all picked up and went back to Bavaria. Now, as I said, the Lithuanians, they finally got there, but they said, okay, we too are going. Now, in the meantime, the Polish troops, remember, they did not have that much provisions. They came on emergency forced march. And so they went to the city and they said, okay, guys, let's, how about some food to feed our troops? They said, oh, no. We have this saved for Austrians. You go take care of yourselves. And Polish troops decided to get a little bit unhappy with that. They said, we're over here fighting. So they decide, hey, let's get back to Warsaw. So the commanders knew they could only push the troops so far. And that's why after the Battle of Padacani, they go back to Poland. And the others disappear. All right. Now, one of the question is, what else, what good came of this? All right, we've got Christianity. I think we've still got some Christianity in Europe today, but some cynics will say first of all, the way the Poles got repaid is 130, 40 years later, Austria delightfully participated in the partition of the Polish kingdom. Because there was Russia, Prussia, and Austria that divided Poland in 1795, the last partition. Austria was one of them, taking her share. Mind you, just 100 and some years ago, they were saving Vienna, and that was then, this is now. And so there's been a kind of question, what good really, why did Poland give so much? And so some cynics have said the only good thing that came out of Vienna, the battle, is the following. One of the key operatives in the Battle of Vienna was Mr. Kulczynski. Now he was an interesting character because he's born in eastern Poland, and those Poland today is part of Ukraine, and he was kind of a sort of a man of fortune. He liked to get around, and he ended up in the military, and he ended up being a prisoner of Turkish forces, the Ottoman. This is before the Battle of Vienna, and he had the talent of learning languages. So he knew Russian, he knew Polish, of course, he knew German, he knew Turkish. He learned it while in prison. He was a slave. Now the Turks decided, slaves are worth not just for what they can do for us, but what they can bring for us in the way of price. So the Turks sold him to some, I think, Romanian merchants. And they used him because these merchants would deal with other countries, and they have to know the language, and they used him as an interpreter. And he was able to get around. And he worked his way, and he put his money together, and he ended up in Vienna, and he had a mercantile business going. But because he knew the Turkish language and the ways, because after all, he was a slave in their country, he dressed up in Turkish garb and went through Turkish forces, through their lines, to the Allies, and would relay information, what unit is where and what their planes are. And then he would go through because he was dressed as it, and he would repeat, how you doing, guy? And he'd walk along, and he was able to get through. Now, his services were so valued that after the Battle of Vienna, as all good militaries would do, you divide up the spoils. And remember now, when the Turks moved, they moved like basically a whole city. And one of the things was like 200, 300 pound bags of coffee. And so old Kulczynski, he understood what to do with coffee because he drank it where he was a slave. And so he said because the king said, what could I give to you as a reward for your services? And he says, those 300 bags of coffee. Now, coffee was unknown in Europe, really. I mean, some of the super rich had it, but no one really liked it because it was kind of bitter, and they didn't really know what to do with it. Now, the Muslims like it because they're forbidden by their religion to drink alcohol, as we know. But coffee gives you a bit kind of a jolt, a little bit of, a high. And so it sort of became a favorite drink that's why they had to have so much with them, so 300 bags of it. And that was his prize. And he takes it and he opens up a coffee shop in Vienna. The first coffee shop, a cafe in Vienna is Mr. Kulczynski. Well, there's something else, that's kind of bitter, right? Because have you ever had real Turkish coffee? Yeah. It comes in this little, container that they boiled and grounds are right inside, and it's bitter, all right. So he was serving it, but to make it a little bit better, more palatable, there was something that the Poles, it's a pastry, and it's called rogaliki. Rogale is horns, like oxen horns. And so what you do is you take a triangular piece of dough, yeast dough, and you put a little jam in, and then you roll it. So the ends end up being skinny, and the middle is the thick part. And if you look at the cow's horn, the thick part would be here, and here are the two ends. Now, because it's yeast, it rises, it proofs up. And it doesn't take too much imagination to realize that you end up with a crescent-looking sort of thing, because it rolls up, and that pastry was served with the coffee. Well, people started calling it the Turkish pastry, Turkish cake, the Turkish cake and coffee. Now, Maria Theresa, the Empress of a few years later of Austria, had lots of kids. And what you do with your kids, if you're an empress or emperor, you have to marry them off to other emperors or kings or future kings. And so one of her daughters, she marries off at the age of, I think, 12, 16, something like that, to the Dauphin of France. And the princess, as was prone to do, and her entourage, and bakers and cooks and maids and all this, go to Paris. So this little girl, Austrian girl, says, I want my coffee and Turkish pastry. And so they're baking it as well. If the future Queen of France, Louis XVI, right, is her future, his husband, likes coffee and pastry, everyone else in court does too. And so they start eating it. But the French don't really know how to do dough made with yeast like the Slavs do. The Slavic people, they know how to do that. That's their specialty. The French, to raise the dough, especially the North France, they make it layered with cold butter between each layer that they keep folding, and that then when it's heated, puffs up. So they make a crescent, and that's the beginning of coffee and croissants in France. So every Frenchman has to have that for breakfast. And that was started by, they've got the name of the baker, if you would like. So, knowing all of this, I go back to Vienna, and I get up to Kallenberg. By the way, you can reach the Kallenberg by a city bus, because it's really in the Vienna woods. We've all known the Vienna woods from music and all that. Okay. Or you can drive. I've done both. And I get up there by bus one time, and it's closed. The church is closed, the museum is closed, and I'm going, all this distance, suffering with those public buses, and now I'm going to have to now go back and not see the church. So the answer is, go around to the side, and there's a button with a name, and it says the nun's name and her button to her quarters. So I press the button, and I clearly woke her up. Because, it was a late morning, and this was after her early morning prayers, and she took a little nap. She later confided she did. So she through the intercom, yes, and of course I'm speaking in Polish. I said, like, hi, I'm from Los Angeles, California, and and I'm playing the role of the dumb tourist, And she said, well, you have to come back at 3 p.m. when you're left. I said, but sister, I have to go back to town and do this, Where did you come from? Los Angeles, California? Yes, California. All right, just a minute. I have to get dressed. Okay. So I wait. She comes down, she opens up the church, and she opens up the gift shop, and she hands me, and she gave me a gift, of course. And it turns out we know some clergy that she knew, that I know, that were in California, and it's, suddenly your relatives, right? Awesome. And so I said to him, here's a chapel, a sidewall, and I said, they've got coats of arms of all that says of the families that fought in the Battle of Vienna. I said, but my family coat of arms is not there. And we've got this, and she said, Panie, which means Mr. Senja, Panie, Mr. Judge, let me tell you, It was only the families that gave the money for the restoration that put their family up there. So your family didn't give enough money. Well, all right. My family was already in America, that's why. So, but all right. But anyway, we established rapport. She was very informative. And then she said, oh my heavens, it's 12 o'clock almost, and she was in charge of the Carillon, because every high noon you play the hey now. You know, call people to church and all that. And high noon, and she's got to go up and ring the Carillon, and she says, but don't run away. You'll be surprised. There'll be a special for you. I'm going like, special? A little concert will be for you. And sure enough, she plays the hey now. Everyone stops and listens respectfully. And then she lets it rip. And there's 15 more minutes of concert. And everyone is looking around, what's going on? And I'm sitting there smiling and enjoying it. I had a private tour of the museum and the church. And it's really kind of cute. Now, St. Stephen's, when the fire burned, here's another tidbit that you won't see in the tourist books. They did have a side chapel where they had a statue of King Sobieski. As luck would have it, the part of the roof that really burnt was right up above his head, and the belfry dropped, boom, and crushed the statue. That's the only real damage that was caused. Fast forward, we're now talking about modern, Poland is free again and all that. And I forget which minister of foreign affairs or religion, or anyway, one of the Polish Mighty Mucks is down there in Vienna during one of the anniversaries, and doing pilgrimage, I guess, and in the presence of the Austrian counterpart, and says the Polish guy, I see you folks have not yet restored King Sobieski. And the Austrian said, what for? He said, well, after all, the Battle of Vienna. Well, if you put it that way, but you'll have to pay for it. And so I have not been back to see if he's reestablished and whether or not the Poles had to pay for it, but bottom line is you will know the history when you go there.
Wow.
So thank you for bearing with me and my rather personal identification with history, but I find it interesting. And it did save Christianity until today, and we'll see how much that lasts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was great.
Awesome. Another round for Judge, okay? All right, guys, it's 9:30. I'll make a move to close the meeting. We'll second. Okay. So, Mark, why don't we come up and say the salvation?
Mater misericordiae, vita docego, espes nostra salve. Ade clamamus, exules Filii Eve, a te suspiramus, gementes et flentes, in hoc lacrimarum mare. Ea ergo, advocata nostra, iros tuos, misericordes oculos, ad nos converte. Jesus, benedictum fructum ventris tui, nobis, post hoc exilium, ostende. O clement, O
All right.
Can I get that from you, Judge? Fantastic job.
Oh, yes, that's not mine.
Perfect, got it. Thank you. Thank you, Judge.
It helps me remember. Thank you so much. Sorry if I was a little rude when I went and sat down.